In this video, I want to talk with you guys about the manuscript evidence that we have for the New Testament, and then also about the Bible translations that we have today and how those come about. So, starting with how we get the English Bible we have today. It's not as if we have always had just this bound book of 66 books within it through all of history. It actually took quite a while and quite a bit of work to get to what we have. So starting with this first step in this process, this is the original autographs in their original language. So the New Testament was written in Greek, and an original autograph would be the very first original text written by the biblical author. So, for example, the original letter that Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus, or the original gospel that Matthew wrote. So that's the first step. And you can see there's this picture here of a manuscript, and you can notice a few things. First, it is not in English, it's in Greek. Second, there is no punctuation and no spaces. And third, it's all in capital letters. So you can see how it would be pretty challenging to get from that to the Bible you have. So then in the second step, we get to copies of the original autographs. And I may have misspoke. So that photo is a copy. It is not the original autograph. We actually don't have any of the original autographs, but what we do have are tons and tons of copies. So in the world of the New Testament, when someone came along with access to something that was written that they valued and thought was important, they made copies of it so that they could then pass on the original. So what we have of the New Testament are lots and lots of copies of this original autograph. And how this would have worked out, here's an example. Paul sends his letter to the church at Ephesus, and because the church valued what he had to say, they would have scribes start making copies of this letter, and then they would send out those copies to share with other people. And so you can see that over the course of several centuries, we start to have a whole lot of these copies. And we'll actually get into about how many we have found as of today. So third in this process is critical editions of the copies in the original languages. So this photo here is a copy of the critical edition that I own. And basically all a critical edition is a group of scholars work on creating this edition. And what goes into it is they collect and get access to every manuscript they can. So ideally that would be any manuscript that we have found up until this point. So thousands of manuscripts they want to have access to. And what they do is they compare the manuscripts and see where they line up and where they have differences. And we'll get into what those differences are. But basically, they develop a whole New Testament in Greek that then has ratings or a confidence system, a level of confidence system that shows their confidence in how close these copies are to the original autograph. And so most of what the critical edition is these scholars saying we are 100% certain that this verse matches 100% the original verse that Paul wrote, or whatever biblical author. So this critical edition is very important in getting from the Greek New Testament to what we have today. And that's the fourth step, and that's translations into English and other languages. So once you have a critical edition, there are very few, and this one here in the picture is actually kind of the top one. It is revered as the best one that you would use. So when a team of scholars is making an English translation, they use that critical edition and they have a certain translation strategy in mind. And we'll go over those strategies here in a bit. but then they use the critical edition and use their strategy and then translate from Greek to English. And then that's how we get what we have today. So that is just kind of a flyby of the process. And if you have questions, I know that it's hard to understand this whole critical edition concept without seeing it. Definitely, you can Google it and look into it, and I would be happy to share photos of my personal copy that I own. So, how many manuscripts are we talking about? As of today, we have 5,800, about 5,800 complete or fragmented Greek New Testament copies. And that kind of breaks down to 2,000 to 3,000 copies of the Gospels, about 800 of the Pauline epistles, letters, 700 of Acts and the general letters, and then about 325 manuscripts of Revelation. So that is a huge number of manuscripts that we have today that we have compiled all throughout history. Now, this is a very important table because it shows just how significant this number of manuscripts is and the accuracy of them. So looking through this list, you see all these people that had written some type of literature that was somewhat contemporary with the New Testament. You see the New Testament there at the bottom. And then you see the date that it was written, and then you see the earliest copy. So the date it is written, that's the date of the original autograph. And then looking over is the date of the earliest copy that has been found. Now I want you to pay attention to a few things in this table. First, look at how many copies there are of the New Testament compared to how many copies there are of any of these other works. Okay, so there's tons and tons, way more of the New Testament than any of these others. Second thing I want you to see is how much time passes between the date that it was written and the date of the earliest copy. And that's what that row in the or column in the middle of the table is about, of how much time has passed between the original and the copy. So notice that for the New Testament, it's less than 100 years. So basically, as soon as these letters or Gospels, as soon as they reached their intended audience, the audience almost immediately started making copies of these. So it's less than 100 years, and I would say less than, 50, less than 20 years, sometimes almost immediately. But that goes back to what is it that, what are the manuscripts that we have found that we can date? But then comparing that to all the others on this table, you see that there were, hundreds of years between this, the date it was originally written and between the earliest copy. Okay, so this is huge. This shows some really big things that give really good evidence for the New Testament that we have. Okay, so critics of the Bible like to say that because of all of these differences in the manuscripts, that there's no way we can know what the original biblical authors intended for us to know. And in these next few slides, I want to make a case that that is not true. We can be very confident that what we have is what the biblical authors originally wrote. So first thing, when we're talking about differences in manuscripts, we're talking about textual variants. And a textual variant is any difference from a standard text that involves spelling, word order, omission, addition, substitution, or a total rewrite of the text. Okay, so if you're comparing two manuscripts, any kind of difference counts as a textual variant. Okay, so prepare for this big number. Scholars estimate that there are roughly 500,000 textual variants. Okay, so that sounds like a big number. But only 0.02% of these variants are meaningful and viable. Okay, so we'll get into what those definitions are, but the key takeaway is that no major or minor Christian doctrine is at stake. So an example is, and I don't even know, I don't think that the New Testament says just John loves Mary, but this gives an example of how many textual variants can start to rack up just in this little 3-word sentence. So when you start to consider the names being misspelled, or word order being different, or presence of an article, or the form of a verb, you could have tens, if not hundreds, of variants just in this small sentence. And this especially becomes important when you know a little bit about the Greek grammar and how the sentence structure is in the Greek. And so if, just for example, if John is misspelled in one text, in one manuscript, that's going to count as a variant for all of the other manuscripts that it is spelled differently in. And same thing with word order. So in the Greek, they do not structure their sentences in the same way we do. And there's a lot more flexibility in terms of word order compared to the English language. And the same thing with presence of article. So with a lot of these, tons of these textual variants, the meaning that is being expressed is 100% clear. It just sometimes there will be a word misspelling or a difference in word order. Okay, so the two definitions that are helpful for you to know are a meaningful variant and a viable variant. So a meaningful variant is one that makes a difference in the actual argument or thought in the text. And so this would be one that, depending on the two manuscripts you're comparing, this meaningful variant is one that actually changed the meaning of the text. There's something major at stake here. On the other hand, a viable variant is one that has a credible amount of manuscript evidence. And this is mostly in terms of the quantity of manuscripts that you have that give evidence to this variant. So say you have two manuscripts that you're comparing, and a viable variant would be one that there are actually hundreds of manuscripts that match what this one says. Okay, so there is a whole lot of manuscript evidence to match what this one says, giving more evidence to this being what the original says. So one thing, so you can kind of divide it up into 4 categories here. You have tons and tons of variants that are neither meaningful nor viable. And then you have 2 that are a combination. But then what we care about are variants that have been deemed meaningful and viable. Those are the ones that we want to look at and make sure there isn't something major going on in the text. So here's an example of a meaningful and viable variant. This is found in Romans 8:1, which says, "Therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." So we have 3 options pictured here of what different manuscripts say. Now the first option is exactly how it is in bold. No condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So then see in option 2, there's a little bit more tacked onto that. At the end it says, "who do not walk according to the flesh." Okay, then looking at option 3, "who do not walk according to the flesh," with the addition, "but walk according to the Spirit." Now, at first glance, you may see this and think, well, those are, completely different. So it is not good that we have, just this option 1, that it's the baseline for these other 2 options. What's important to see is when you compare these manuscripts and you look at the passage as a whole, this option 3 that specifically talks about not walking according to the flesh, but walking according to the Spirit, that exact same sentence is just a couple of verses down. And so this could have easily been copied as something to verge on redundancy, where you have it twice, or it could have been just a mistaken add-on. And so when scholars get together and determine the basis for these variants, they look at how option 1 has the better manuscript evidence for it being this shorter claim, And that's okay. It's meaningful, but it doesn't change the whole meaning of the passage, because you still have that that same sentiment in a couple of, I think it's 2 verses later. Okay, so now I want to give just a brief history of translations and talk a little bit about the translation strategies. So the King James Version Bible was the first English Bible, and it was published in 1611. And it was published based on the majority text, which was the first Greek New Testament. So the first Greek New Testament, all fully put together, the way we have it now, but in Greek, that was published in 1516. And it was based on only about 20 Greek manuscripts. Okay, so the person that put the majority text together only had access to about 20 manuscripts. So he went about reconciling those manuscripts and came up with the majority text. And then, less than 100 years later, someone goes about translating that from Greek to English. Now, keep in mind, this early on in history, it probably wasn't this neat and tidy process like we have today with the critical edition and a whole team of scholars. Okay, so things were a little bit different. But in the last century, we have discovered far more manuscripts that date back way older than what was used in the majority text. So I talked about the age of manuscripts and how we have manuscripts that we have compiled from over several centuries. And so the King James Version was actually based on manuscripts that were not super early. Okay, so they were written probably, I can't remember exactly, but 400 to 500 years after the events of the New Testament. But since then, we've discovered far more manuscripts that date back much earlier, as early as the 2nd century. Okay, so with all of this new evidence we have, major translations have been done by other scholars that seem to be more accurate, since they are based on far more Greek manuscripts that are better in quality and quantity. Because really, when you're comparing manuscripts, what is very important is the age of the manuscripts. So that's kind of the two things. You look at age of manuscript and quantity, if there are a whole lot of manuscripts that say the same thing. So the ASV translation was in 1901, NIV in 1978, and ESV in 2001. And we continue to see revisions of these and even new translations today. So talking a little bit about Bible translations, there's kind of this spectrum here of what the strategy is when a group of scholars works on translating from Greek to English. And we're going to talk a little bit about these strategies. So the first strategy is a formal translation, which means word for word. And to help you better understand what I mean by this, think of idioms in the English language. And the example I'll use is the claim, "It's raining cats and dogs." Okay, so in English, most of us hopefully know exactly what that means. That it's not literally raining cats and dogs, but it's raining really hard. So a formal translation, a word for word, they aim to carry over as much of the form of the original language as possible, sometimes even at the expense of using the most easily understandable English. So the way that a formal translation handles an idiom is they're going to take the exact words in the Greek, for example, using our example, "It's raining cats and dogs," and they're going to translate that to English. Now, for the reader that reads a formal translation, they're going to have to do the hard work of seeking the meaning of this text when it doesn't use easily understandable English. So for someone that wasn't familiar with the idiom, "It's raining cats and dogs," they would have to do the work of kind of the contextual work of seeing what does that mean to the intended audience. We, as Americans, would know what that idiom meant. But for someone that was reading the sentence, "It's raining cats and dogs," and is not from this culture, they have to do the work of figuring out what it means to our culture. Okay, so some examples of this would be the NASB, the King James Version, and the ESV. So then on the other side of the spectrum, you have dynamic or functional equivalence translations, and these are more on paraphrase. So they aim to understand the meaning of the original language and then make it to where it's easily understood. So some examples of this are the Good News translation and the Message. So they're going to take idioms like "it's raining cats and dogs" and they're going to think about their intended audience and come up with a phrase that this audience will easily understand. And then finally, you have an optimally equivalent translation, which is thought for thought. And these try to be somewhere in the middle and not prioritize clarity over accuracy or vice versa. So they want to attain as much of both as possible in the passages. So they want to make sure that the idioms make sense and the figures of speech are understandable while also holding to as much word-for-word accuracy as they can. So examples of this include the Net Bible, the NIV, and the NLT. And so as you're reading through the New Testament, I would say one of these thought for thought is great to be using. Okay, finally, if you have any questions, please reach out. This was one of my favorite topics when I was in my master's program, and so I would love to continue to talk this over with you.